alaikum. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking out time to be here. I know a lot of other interesting sessions are going on, so I'm really grateful that you're here, not to hear me, but to hear Dr. Iftikhar and Dr. Nomanul. Dr. Iftikhar's books I've read, and Noman is a former colleague and also someone I'm extremely fond of and very, very convinced of his scholarly work, and great fan of his, actually. And so, of course, Dr. Iftikhar with 20 books to his credit. So when he puts his pen to something, we need to take it seriously. I read this book, and I am not a historian. But I always think that history is the last verdict on anything. One. Two, I agree with Mark Twain. It does not repeat itself. History rhymes. So the two historians here would probably tell me if that's true or not. The book is an absolute intellectual treat. I enjoyed reading it because it was an amalgam of both information and knowledge. It brings together 40 years of the author's experience and is across 4 continents. It has about 22 separate articles. He calls them narratives. And they're very interestingly divided into 3 components. The first component is that of memoirs. The second is traversing the Silk Road, and then nestling in the West. So in some ways, he's lived in the West, he studied in the West, and then he has sort of took the lens of a Muslim historian to look at things. So, Dr. Iftikhar, the first thing that I want to ask you is that when you write history, do you have this Muslim paradigm to it? What is Muslim history or the Muslim lens? And then I'll come to more questions.
Well, thank you very much for your very elaborate introduction. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm glad that Professor Noman has been able to make it. My whole life has been the life of a researcher, a student of Muslim history, world history. I also taught courses on the British Empire, and you remember after the First World War, Lord Curzon, when he was the Foreign Secretary, he said that Britain was the largest Mohammedan power in the world. So there was this connection. I mean, this morning we were talking about cricket, and so my interest is across these different genres in history. But generally, I wrote about South Asian Muslims. Then, after 9/11, I got more interested in a kind of debate about Islam. Like, I published 2 books previously with OUP, taking issues with Professor Bernard Lewis, some French scholars, some Italian scholars, what they were writing about Islam. Islam is a big subject. I mean, 10 years ago, a British academic magazine suggested, which is true, that every 7 minutes there was a new book, new article, new video, new report on Islam-related subjects. So it's a big subject, and lots of people are interested in studying Muslim communities, Muslim culture, history, from all kind of perspective. And also, that 20 to 30% Muslims in the world, they live in diaspora. They live as minority communities, whether you look at India or you look at Russia. And I think in Europe and America, Noman will bear me out, we make a visible presence. In some cases, this presence has been very recent. So I wanted to see some kind of commonalities. And number 2, I wanted to bring in not just my own autobiographical kind of details, but also to see how there are areas or cultures or thought processes or historical events that sort of bring Muslims together. I mean, Fez is not located strictly on the Silk Road, but I could relate it with the Silk Road, and I could relate it in reference to many other things like Spain or Pisa, for example. There are chapters on Pisa because in Pisa, behind Galileo's Leaning Tower, I discovered, because I used to teach there as a visiting professor, they had a soil of a cemetery, and the soil was brought from Palestine, during the Crusades. So I found connection with, of course, Sicily. Muslims are in Sicily and Palermo. So there are chapters on Jerusalem, because all the pilgrims and, many Muslims would go to to Jerusalem. I mean, when they would go for Hajj or all that. So to me, Silk Road was an excuse to look at the commonalities and to look at the heritage, which sadly, in urban areas, in across the Muslim world, we are not really very, sort of reverent to. And I'm worried that pollution and population explosion and this whole, fascination or obsession for building big mansions, they are all destroying our environment. I see it in Lahore every day because I'm teaching there as a visiting professor. I see that in Delhi, I see that in Agra. Though some Central Asian cities are still very pristine, like Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, especially Khiva, I mean, is one of my favorite cities. The first city on World Silk Road, which has been declared the World Heritage City by UNESCO. Fez is one of the most beautiful places, medieval. As a historian, I was fascinated by Fez. But it's very difficult to maintain these cities. And so I thought maybe, some people would read about it, would relink with the history, and also with this sense that everything is wrong with Muslims and their past and their heritage.
So if I may interrupt you, you bring in the concept of othering the Muslims. You talk about the concept of how our youth, which for Pakistan means a lot because 60% of our population is under the age of 35, how youth are predominantly, for lack of availability, read historical narratives that are written by Westerners or are not truly depictive of what the situation is on the ground. So what have you done to capture that?
Well, I didn't want to make it too scholarly, and I wanted to make it a kind of easy read. And I don't know whether, Noman and other readers have been able to catch that. Because I've done books. I mean, I've done a couple of books after this book, and they're very scholarly, and they talk about, British writers before colonialism about Islam. Like the first English philosopher, Adilard, not many people know about him, even in England. Was actually a student of Islamic studies, and he spent 7 years in Antioch and Damascus, and he learned Arabic. He's the man who translated Khwarizmi, and this is how we got the word algorithm, and so Khwarizmi was translated into Latin. And some people think he introduced zero in England, because he took the Indian numerals, what you call Arabic numerals, and because the Roman numerals didn't have zero. So I did that book. But this book, I wanted to be an easy read. A reader could go with me. I mean, there is a story about Air Marshal Nur Khan and his mother, because my elder sister opened a school for the girls in his native town, and there was quite a bit of resistance. So there are these kind of stories. But I also wanted to link it with Helsinki. I mean, you would say Helsinki. I mean, it has got no connection with Silk Road. Helsinki in Finland has one of the oldest Muslim communities in Europe. These are Tatars who were taken there by the Russians. They were part of the Russian army. And I interacted with them, and a couple of them told me they had been to Pakistan to buy carpets in the 1980s. So you could find Helsinki linked with the Tatars, and Tatars are, of course, one of the main ethnic communities. So I thought that these cities will create a kind of interest indirectly into sort of exploring a historical...
Absolutely. He's absolutely right. He's tried to make the read easy, and there's subtle humor. So there is a chapter on Hakimji, which I found very interesting. Then there is a chapter on Switzerland, which says the land of honey or whose money. And there's a lot of information, but it also tells us that for, 3 centuries, that country has chosen to be neutral. Whereas the world history tells us that for 1 year of peace, there are 13 years of conflict. So there are reasons why Switzerland is what it is. And then there are some sobering discussions. For example, there is a mention of 2011 floods in which 20 million people were affected. And when I was reading that, I said 2022 floods affected much more than that, 33 million people. Then there is one sentence on South Asia that just stuck to me, and that haunts me, is any responsible showdown, we will only be left with losers and no winners. So all of this tells you that how important this particular narrative is, this particular book is, because it also unites you. It goes to our roots. And how perhaps functional relationship in this region is so critical and important. But I would also want Professor Noman to comment on the chapters. And there is a sprinkle of poetry all across the book, which I found very fascinating. So we have a verse in Persian, and then we have an Urdu Roman translation of it, and then followed by an English translation. I am not very versed in poetry, but I enjoyed all of them. So Noman, over to you.
Well, I mean, let me first of all say that Iftikhar Malik Sahab has made a new departure. Writing history in this mode is not very common. To travel and to look at living realities and the vibrancy or living realities that you have experienced, meeting people and looking at the continuity of customs and culture and architecture and art and language and so on. You talk about an Urdu-speaking Uzbek outside Tamerlane's tomb. That I find fascinating. And one thing that you point out, and I think is very urgent these days, and it is that young people somehow have begun to doubt their legacy. First of all, there is a disconnect between the legacy and young people. They have no touch with the legacy. Our languages are gone. You know, the languages are gone, Persian and Arabic and Urdu. And you say that it is important for you to reconnect that in a multidimensional way. And if you're able to do that, I think that this will be a tremendously important service to the young people, because they are, you say they're skeptical of their legacy. I say that they are dismissive of their legacy, ashamed of their legacy. So if this is your concern, I think it's a very important one. So maybe you could say a few things about that.
Well, I think not every Muslim country or society is irreverent to their heritage. I mean, next door, Iran, I was so enthused and inspired. Isfahan is really Neem or Nisf Jahan. They used to say about Lahore the same thing, but, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Lahore is, but South Asian cities are in a sorry state of affairs, sadly, because of our irreverence. Uzbekistan, they really look after their, cities. I mean, some of you might have been to. Tashkent is a Russian kind of, reconstruction after the earthquake, but it's still in Tashkent. There are beautiful areas worth visiting. And also, of course, Samarkand and Shahrisabz and Bukhara is, reminds you a little bit of old Multan. And there is an area in Samarkand next to Khanum's mosque, which is called Multani area. These were the people whose ancestors were taken to Central Asia by Tamerlane. Konya is a beautiful place. I think Turks also look after their heritage. So I would really, ask you people, not just to read the book, but to visit these places where you may feel inspired, visiting Fez, visiting even Jerusalem. I know it was very difficult, but I have friends on both sides, my colleagues, historians, Israelis and Palestinians, and I spent 2 weeks there. And there's lots of South Asian connection. I mean, other than religious connection with Jerusalem. Not many people know that Abdul Ghaffar Khan's first wife is buried there. Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar, an Oxford graduate, he was buried in Masjid-e-Aqsa itself. And there is Baba Farid's hermitage, because Baba Farid went there about 13th century after Jerusalem was recaptured by Salahuddin Ayyubi. So Baba Farid went and did his chilla, and now it is called Indian Hermitage. And you see the portrait of Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru. But so there is this. So there are all these kind of connections that I discovered, and of course Cordova, Granada. Those are the places where you see lots of architectural, tradition, which many European Muslims, Muslims second generation, third generation, are discovering. And you mentioned poetry, and because I attended sessions on Khaja Hafiz in London, so I wrote an article on that. But there are places like in London or in other metropolitan centers. There's lots of Muslim heritage, manuscripts, miniatures, art, pieces, all those kind of things which you find in British Library, British Museum, or Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I didn't want to ignore West as well, being part of the Silk Road or Muslim experience.
Yes.
Great. Okay, Noman, please go ahead.
Huma talked about poetry. So let me be a little bit specific. You have quoted the famous verse of Hafiz, Agar an Turk Shirazi badast arad dile mara, bakhale Hinduas baksham, Samarkando Kandhara ra. How does it fit into your narrative?
To tell you the truth, I didn't want to visit. I have been to Uzbekistan many times. I taught there. I was part of an international consortium on higher education. I wanted to avoid Taimur, but because he killed so many people. But then you can't ignore it when you're in Samarkand. And I wanted to visit Taimur's tomb partly because of his grandson. His daughter-in-law built universities in Herat, Gohar Shah Begum. And this is Gohar Shah's son, who is buried next to Amir Taimur. So I ended up visiting Taimur. But I was also thinking about this Persianate that Marshall Hyson talks about. And Professor Shahab Ahmed, Marhum Shahab Ahmed, calls it Islamicate or Bosnia to Bengal syndrome, that this Muslim cultural intellectual unity. So I go to that and I wrote about it, and then I was invited by Moscow State University to give a talk. And these people, they're called Uzbek, but many of them are Tajiks, so they can understand Farsi. So I started my lecture, and it's only 100 meters from Amir Taimur's tomb. So I read this, Agar Turke Shiraze Badastara Dele Mara Bakhale Hindu Ashbak Sham Samarkando Bukhari. They all laughed because this is their city, Samarkand. And there is Taimur there, and this is Khaja Hafiz. And this is a story about it. So I think when I wrote the chapter about Rumi, I was taken back to his Masnavi, and maybe I got a bit carried away and with Rumi. But first I went to Shams. I have been to Konya many times because they invite me for lectures, and I have some students there, very good students at Seljuk University. So you first go to the tomb of Shams Tabrizi, because that's the tradition. First you go to the teacher, and then from teacher, then you go to the pupil, which is Rumi's mazar, only 100. So I was fascinated by Rumi, and I could see how during the medieval period, despite this dislocation by the Mongols and crusades from the west, Mongols from the east, these people had humor, they had intellect, they had stability, they had maturity. And that's what I found in Maulana Rumi. Though I have my own reservations about Sufism, I'm more on the side of Mu'tazila,
Professor
to tell
Dr.
you the
Noman
truth.
has a question, and then I will pose mine.
Malik Sahab, allow me some mischief. You talk about manuscripts and artwork in Europe from the Islamic heritage. Much of it is a result of plunder, isn't it? So how does it fit into your narrative? It is plunder. In fact, organized plunder. Recently, Mannan Ahmad was here, and he has a lot to say about this, that there is a systematic plan of plundering these things. So it cannot fit into that, very nice story of human transmissions.
I think you're very right, Noman, that this heritage has connection with the colonial plunder. And I think it's a moral question, it's a legal question, that how these things should be repatriated. I mean, we hear a lot about Greek marbles, which were taken by the British to British Museum, and Greek government keeps asking about. Recently, some of those artifacts were repatriated to Nigeria, but there's lots of smuggling as well. Lots of us are worried about smuggling of our heritage or heritage from the south to the west. And you know about the story of starving Buddha, which was being smuggled to North America. And more recently, I think America has sent back some artifacts to Pakistan as well. So they were smuggled out of the country. So I think Noman is, on the one hand, I totally agree with you that this heritage should come back, but we should also develop mechanisms in our part of the world that these things are not smuggled out and or they're not embezzled. Because as we talk about corruption all the time, I think we need to have mechanism, but it still doesn't justify that this heritage should be kept somewhere else. So maybe it's a world heritage. It should be shared by
Yes,
everyone.
I mean, they do not manifest cultural continuities. In fact, they manifest a rupture, right? And so one has to separate it from the rest of the narrative. That is my concern. You know,
Right.
there
I
are some.
have a question for both of you, if you allow me. You
Can
see,
I just add
yes.
one
Yeah,
more
yeah, sure.
sentence? There are some letters that Iqbal wrote to Sir William Rothenstein, which are in Harvard, and it is in the Houghton collection of Harvard. Houghton was a collector, and he's the one who dismembered the Shahnameh of Firdausi. Each leaf of it was auctioned for millions of dollars, as you know. Each leaf, it was dismembered, it was interfered with. So we have to address that too. I mean, this story looks very sweet and romantic, but there are ruptures which we have to attend to.
Very right,
Yeah,
yeah, but we shouldn't forget the fact that there were people who were really concerned about our heritage. The first book about Shia Islam in English was written by a woman, an English woman in Lucknow, because she was married to a Muslim chap from Faizabad. So there was another woman, I mean, in my other book I talk about her, Fanny Parks. Fanny Parks is the person who shamed British East India officials in the 1820s and 1830s that they were holding dances and their balls at Taj Mahal. And she said, come on, you should be ashamed of the fact this is a mausoleum. There are two people buried here and you are having your parties here. And some people in the British East India Company were trying to smuggle out marble from Agra Fort. And she raised this issue. So there were people whom you could call looters or whatever, but there were people who were trying to preserve. I mean, the most powerful thing that I ever saw or ever read about in my other book was when Fanny Parks or Mrs. Ali, the other lady who wrote the book, first book in English on Shia Islam, they went to see the Mughal emperor, Shah Alam, and she gave a present to the emperor, and the emperor and the queen were sitting on a charpai in Delhi, and they didn't have anything to return, so they just gave them jasmine ka wo johar hota hai, wo diya tha. And this woman comes out and she cries that these are the descendants of Babur, these are the descendants of Tamerlane, and today they are so poor. Something that Dalrymple talks about in The Last Emperor. So I think there were people, and we should not sort of put them in a kind of monolithic category that they were very much irreverent to our heritage or any heritage from Africa or Native Americans or Asia. So there were good people, and there's still good people who are trying to share this heritage with the rest of the world. And this decolonial studies, as we academics call it, is also raising this issue. Roads must fall, and how these things should go back to the places where they are originated from. But this is a very, very tricky, I mean, we historians go to British Library because we want to work on India or, struggle or Persian past or Chinese or these scholars from all over the world coming to the British Library. So at one level, I know that these things have been stolen or have been taken away from all these places, but at another level, I'm very pleased that at least at one place these things are preserved, and as a student of history, as a researcher, I'm able to consult them, which I can't do even in Anarkali Stone. आपको पता है आपके जो पंजाब के आर्काइव्स हैं, आप जाएं ना अनारकली टूम में, वो देते भी नहीं हैं, शेयर भी नहीं करते. प्रोफेसर जाफर साहब बैठे हैं, इनसे पूछिए, हमारे अपने आर्काइव्स हमें अवेलेबल नहीं. At least they are available in those places. So I think it's a mixed kind of situation.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to whet your appetite for the book, because what I find fascinating is the title itself, because it says Narratives of a Muslim Historian. I think that's important. That's critical. That gives us the ability to hear a view from a Muslim across 4 continents. And then he, in his introduction, writes, and I'll quote it, "The book is an effort to capture history, literature, mobility, crafts, architectural traditions, cultural vistas by focusing on diverse Muslim individual communities, cities, and their edifices." Do you agree with that? Has the book done that? And then I'll come to you to defend it.
See, I am a tremendous admirer of the flow of the narrative, and indeed, you have covered a lot. In fact, there will be areas in which you might not feel that you're an expert, but you have covered it. So Russ, yes, and I think, as I said, this is really a new way of doing history. The vibrancy of living traditions. Now, what I was pointing out is that there are two kinds of heritages. One is, of course, through cultural continuities, through cultural transmission, and the other were through ruptures and colonialism, and one has to separate the two. This is what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. Iftikhar, last word is yours, Professor. And have you really deviated from how history is usually written?
Well, I don't know whether you will call it a kind of popular history or easy read or whatever. I did try, and it becomes, sometimes I was very uncomfortable because there was lots of me and lots of I, and I was, I felt embarrassed because when you write as a historian, you are detached. You have to be very objective. So this was a different experience for me, but I relished it.
Yes.
Because now I'm getting good reviews. Sir Jeremy Farrer, who is the head of Wellcome Trust, he got in touch with me through somebody in America, and he said, I want to see you because I want you to autograph this book. And he had picked it up from a bookstore in Oxford. And so he recommended it in his review just before Christmas in The Guardian, that this is the book if you want to read over Christmas or break. So I felt quite flattered that the people are taking it seriously. And then Jeremy called me up, and we went to Ashmolean Museum, and we had a nice cup of coffee. And I could see that, people want something like an easy read they could relate with, and they could follow. Yes. But there is another interesting book, if you are, sort of keen in following this area, by Justin Moruzzi. And it talks about Islamic civilization in reference to 15 cities. It came out only 2 years ago. And he talks about these cities, and sadly there is an element of tragedy. He says that most of these cities which defined Islamic civilization eventually got destroyed, either by Muslims themselves or by somebody else. For example, he talks about Merv, which was the most beautiful city in medieval period, now in Turkmenistan. Yes. And he talks about Samarkand and how it was destroyed, Bukhara, all those places, Nishapur. And he has a chapter on Beirut, how civil war has destroyed Beirut, how Libyan city, because he was born in Tripoli, he's Italian English. So lots of people are now looking back at cities in reference to civilization, and they look at these. So Justin Moruzzi's book is very interesting. I mean, it's a kind of, it appeared after my book. I mean, it doesn't talk about me, but I thought, there are serious historians who are looking back at these cities in reference to the history of Muslim civilization.
Great. Yes, please go ahead.
As for too many eyes in the book, I think you yourself say that this is an autobiographical genre, so you're exonerated.
Which I'm going to get my copy autographed by you. You have a chance to buy the book and get it autographed by the author. We are now going to open the floor for Q&A. I already see a hand at the back.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम मेरा नाम कैप्टन फरीद मसूद है I'm British merchant naval captain and I've been to all around but I wanted to explore all those Muslim places where my ship couldn't go there. So I've been all these places what you have been mentioning, most of them. Have you mentioned about Karachi, Pakistan and these what had happened to it in Uzbekistan about it? Karachi, Pakistan. Karachi, Pakistan.
Karachi, Pakistan, right?
Pakistan.
Have I got it right?
Pakistan.
Yeah, it's not Pakistan. It's
Pakistan.
It's Pakistan.
That's what I said, Pakistan.
It's the westernmost region of Uzbekistan. If you go beyond Khiva.
No, I've been there. I've been there. But have you mentioned in your books?
Yeah, but our Pakistan and that Pakistan, you could say, well, these are two different territories. But Khiva, south of Khiva, I was telling Noman, is a beautiful place. It's called Urgench. That is where the great prophet Zoroaster was born, Zartusht, जिसके होटल में आप बैठे हुए हैं और our past, that's our past. Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all converged in Central Asia. It's not just Pakistan, there's lots of history.
Sorry, you mistook me.
Does it have a mention in your book? That's what he's asking.
Well, I'm planning to do a research paper on Khiva because I've done lots of research on Khiva. That's going to be a scholarly paper, separate paper.
Thank you, sir. We're going to take more questions. Yes, please go ahead. Also introduce yourself. I did see a lady raise her hand. Would you let the lady go first, please? And then we'll come to you. Please go ahead.
Just a quick question. I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on whom it suits to have their historical archives open. Because as we know, when history is written from a particular perspective, it might suit somebody to have those archives available to people, and there might be another side that is trying to cover up that history and therefore would not allow the archives to be open, which it has in its possession. I hope I'm being able to sort of put my question clearly enough, articulately enough. So for instance, I understand the benefits of being able to go to the British Library or their home office and to look at the documents over there. But if that is history on this part of the world written from their perspective, then wouldn't they want that those archives should be available commonly? Are there any thoughts on that?
Well, you may call me cosmopolitan kind of person, but I don't think there are people sitting there, sort of conspiring against, Muslims or any community as such. I think those archives are available. It's up to you. How do you interpret them? And this is we historians agree to disagree. So whether those archives are in Lahore and Karachi or in Isfahan or in London, I'm not worried about it, where they're kept, as long as they are accessible to me, they are available to me. And I think history is such a strong subject in Britain because of the empire, that you are supposed to go to these places if you really want to do a scholarly work. If you want to do international relations, if you want to do political science, naturally you would prefer going to the United States. So I think my interest in Pakistan would be, that's what I'm trying to do, trying to help students in Lahore, in universities to access the archives and then interpret them in a scholarly way. And number two, I think governments like Pakistan should try to get some of those archives in their digital forms available. But I think we need special sessions in this country to make government and the people who run archives sensitive and helpful to the needs and imperatives of researchers, because I studied in Lahore 50 years ago. We couldn't go into an archive tome. And, even now, when I run into students, they have problems. The people are not being helpful. First, archives are not properly looked after. There's a whole story about Qaid-e-Azam papers or Muslim League papers. They were left here, on the rooftop. Zaidi Saab ne aur unhone milko unko mahfuz kiya. So I think we need to create awareness about the importance of the archives and making them available. And then, the governments could exchange those archives. I think the people in Britain and America would also need archives that we keep for research over there.
For objective analysis. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is to Iftikhar Sahab, that on the Silk Road, the most important part is the Gilgit-Baltistan. And of course, and this is part of Pakistan. And our neighbors are also claiming that part. And of course, we have the insurgency in Balochistan. And if that dispute will intensify, hope not, then what will be the future of the CPAC?
Well, I don't know about CPAC. You guys have to decide it yourself. But Baltistan is not only the part of Silk Road. आपका Taxila जो है, आपका जो गंधारा है, ये सारा Silk Road का था. Buddhism यहाँ से गया है. Buddhism went via Silk Road into Nepal. Nepal and Tibet and China and all the way to Japan. And there were Chinese visitors, travelers, scholars who were coming into Taxila. And this is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Indus Valley civilization. My historian friends would know Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were discovered exactly 100 years ago. So this is a year of relinking with Gandhara civilization. And Gandhara included parts of Central Asia. So it's not just Baltistan. बाकी जो geopolitics है उस पे तो हमारा नहीं है, लेकिन दुनिया में empires भी compete करती रही हैं, अब nation states conflict कर रहे हैं. Sadly, we have inherited quite a bit of conflict. And that Central Asia itself has all these conflicts. ये पहले Soviet Union का हिस्सा थी, लेकिन अब उनके दरमियान भी territorial issues हैं. It's not just India, Pakistan, or India and China. There are lots of conflicts. But the way forward is that we keep trying for some kind of regional cooperation. But Silk Road is important. ये जो CPEC है, इसकी जो geopolitics है, ये trade है, उससे भी Chinese inspired तो होते हैं. But it's not just one way. It's not just China that was exporting silk. Silk, I mean, it was called Silk Road by a German in 1870. But there were lots of other things. Religion सबसे ज़्यादा मैं समझता हूँ important है. जो Silk Road के through गया. Before Judaism and Christianity went to Europe, they came east. So they have discovered lots of Hebrew prayers in the Dunhuang caves, जो Western China में हैं. They have found things in Kharoshti. They have found things in Tibetan. So there are lots of things, art, culture, history, most of all religions and architecture. So Silk Road सिर्फ silk की नहीं है और इसी तरीके से I think Chinese are trying to make money or whatever. It's their geopolitical interest, the way Russians had their political interest or Britain had political interest in this area. That's what we call the Great Game. So India and Pakistan sadly have inherited those tensions, but the way forward is that these countries somehow cooperate regionally like the Europeans. So the scholars could move, the travelers could move, the tourists could move, and the money we are wasting on weapons and those things, we could spend on archives and books and have more literary festivals.
I will just we'll run out of time. Just one more question. Very quick, please. It always gets interesting towards the end.
Delighted to hear your talk. And I wanted to say that, you know, we always forget that it was the nomads and the semi-nomads along the ancient Silk Road that actually created our designs, the arabesque designs, the carpets. It was their vision that created the most beautiful textiles that we all just love to claim. I wish you'd said a bit more about it had I asked this question earlier. I did an exhibition in London called Embroidered Tales and Woven Dreams. And these were their embroidered tales and woven dreams that have given us the richest culture, textile culture, story, narrative cultures that we've ever had.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you raised it. I'm sure Noman will agree with me. These nomads...
Have you brought any samples here?
Unfortunately not, because if I brought them here, I would be able to take them back out of the country again.
Well, you're very right. Nomads, shepherds. I mean, people generally now look down upon tribal people. Being tribal is considered to be very parochial, especially after 9/11. But when I go somewhere else for seminars, I generally say, I mean, when you talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan, I say, look, I'm going to talk about tribal societies, but for the last 35 years, I've been living in a very tribal city. And then after a pause, I say Oxford, with 38 colleges, all different. But you're right, nomads created civilization. That is what Ibn Khaldun is all about. And don't forget, and art and culture.
And while you don't like Tamerlane because he killed so many people, he also met Ibn Khaldun. And that changed the course of history.
Well, it was too late after he had killed millions of people.
Two historians on the panel, it becomes very hard. Thank you, Professor Noman.
It could have been worse.
मूसा, आप कहानियां जो पढ़ते हैं, हजरत मूसा शेपर्ड था. हजूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम जो हमारे prophet थे, वो भी shepherd थे. So nomads and shepherds and these people, I mean, not just the conquerors like Genghis Khan or Tamerlane. You know, these prophets, many of them had this kind of background, nomadic. But sadly, we live in a world where the cities are deciding the future.
Thank you so much, Professor. The book is very interesting because it talks about Samarkand एक तिल के पीछे देने पर, फिर उस पे नाराजगी और फिर उसके नतीजे में क्या होता है. So it has several such stories which are very, very interesting. I urge you to buy the book, get it signed by the author. It is a very interesting read. Congratulations, Professor Iftikhar, and thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Noman, for adding value to this discussion. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
we're
very
going
much.
to sign now. I thought I'd take you on that.